Hello, and welcome to episode 36 of Sarastro's Star Wars Legion painting series. In this video, I'll be painting the first 3 units of a brand new Imperial army from the Star Wars Legion miniatures game by Atomic Mass Games. I'll be painting a squad of Stormtroopers, which actually has 11 figures in the box, along with a squad of Scout Troopers, and the Riot Control Squad, which are all brand new sculpts and cast in a nice hard plastic. Naturally, I chose to bundle these squads together for the sake of efficiency, as I'll largely be using the same colours and painting techniques for all 3, including a super easy and efficient approach to painting all that white armour. Here's a quick overview of the painting process. For the benefit of anyone who might be new to the hobby, we'll first explore the basics of assembling and priming the models, where I'll be recommending either some wide coverage zenithal highlights or a plain prime in white. I also chose to provide some basing at this point to establish the environmental setting. After painting all of the black details on the models, I'll be applying a bespoke wash to the armour to create some quick and easy shading and ambience. This approach will save us from the pain of having to add multiple layers of highlight afterwards. We can then follow this with some weathering and a few quick specular highlights, and along the way we'll take care of some of the other remaining elements such as the Pauldrons, Riot Batons, and the 2 security droids. There's quite a lot to cover, but you can find chapter links to help navigate the episode. Let's begin. To assemble the models, we'll need some nippers, plastic glue, and something to remove any mould lines with. I'm using the red grass precision nippers and scraping 1 or 2 mould lines off with the edge of a craft knife, and I'd pay particular attention to the tops of the helmets. This is the Tamiya extra thin cement, and we only need to apply a small amount to glue the parts together. Assembling 3 complete units might take some time, but I find taking regular breaks and enjoying a little background entertainment helps make it a pretty pleasant part of the process. Because the bases are made of a different type of plastic, I find using superglue to stick the figures down usually gives the strongest bond. I'm keeping any spare parts and also chopping up some spare bits of speeder bike to use as optional basing elements. Because I'm going for a desert-like outer rim type of theme for my army, I chose to swap out the logs that come with the Scout Troopers for something that looks like mechanical scrap. And for others, I'm using some small rock formations by Epic Basing. Before priming, I can highly recommend sticking the figures down onto some kind of holder, even if it's just a spare paint pot or bottle cap. These are actually part of the Game Envy hobby holder system, and I'm simply using white tack to hold the minis in place. I'm now heading to the spray booth where I'm using the aqueous black surfacer primer mixed with an equal amount of thinner to prime the figures in black, and as always I like to use a good quality breathing mask. You could of course use a rattle can primer here instead, and if you want to skip the zenithal highlights, a simple prime in white would be fine. I'm now going to apply some cold grey to most of the figure, followed with some white directly from above. I want the grey to hit all of the main panels of the armour and shields, with the darker recesses left black if possible. I'm also spraying the security droids with this, but won't be applying the white, as the figures are pretty dark. I'm now applying the pure white from above, where we want to achieve maximum values for places like the tops of the helmets and shoulders, with some soft gradations elsewhere. This gives us quite a bright white look, with some subtle variations in levels across the model that will synergize nicely with the wash we'll be adding in a while. Once again though, a plain prime in white would also be okay. I'm now going to provide some basing for the models, which you could also do before priming, or as a final step after painting if you like. I chose to do it after priming because I want to retain the natural colour of the materials, and I'm doing it before painting because I find establishing a sense of environment or ambience helps to guide my colour choices. For my outer rim look, I'm starting with some brown earth basing paste by Vallejo, then sprinkling on a few large cork rocks, followed with some coarse sand, before covering the rest with some fine sand. I've also included a few pieces of scrap debris for some of the bases. Once dry, I'm now sealing everything in place with some Mod Podge or PVA glue thinned down with water. This will just prevent any pieces of sand from coming loose on the battlefield. With that done, we're ready to begin painting. I'm starting with what is probably the least fun part of the painting process, which is painting all of the black details on the figures. This includes the exposed parts of the black bodysuit, as well as the black detailing on the helmets. For the mouth area, I'll typically thin the paint a little more than usual so that it flows nicely into the gaps. This is a very optional detail, but the slits on the sides of the helmet are actually a dark blue, which I'm mixing here with some dark blue and a little black. And for what it's worth, the recessed detailing near the top of the helmet is a dark grey. We can touch up any mistakes with a matching white or off-white, or indeed disguise them with weathering later on. For the larger areas of black we have on the Scout Troopers' legs and arms, I might thin some black with medium to help create some natural shading. Similarly, you could use your go-to speed paints for this. And for the weapons, I chose to mix a slightly blue-tinted black, using a mix of black and green-grey, but really any black would be fine. We can also paint the straps on the Riot Troopers, along with any other remaining peripherals and weapons. Here I'm thinning the paint out towards the crackling end of these Riot Batons, which I want to remain white. And I'm also hitting any bits of metallic debris. After a final bit of tidying up, we're now ready to add some shading. I'm now going to create a wash designed to add some depth in the shadows and recesses, whilst also providing an ambient tint to the armour to match the environmental setting. To do that, I'm using just a couple of drops of the brown and black Pro-Acryl transparent paints, which I'm thinning right down with some glaze and wash medium. These paints have an ink-like intensity, and I'm placing exactly 1 drop of the brown and 2 drops of the black into a spare palette well. I'm then filling the well with the medium and giving it a good mix. This gives me just the right level of saturation and depth that I'm looking for. I'm starting with the legs, and it's fine if we also hit the black areas in the process. The wash has quite a viscous consistency that helps create a pretty smooth, streak-free finish, that's also quite easy to push around and manipulate on the figure. Naturally, we want to encourage the wash to settle into the recesses and panel lines, and at the same time we want to soak the wash up from the flatter and more upturned areas. So you'll often see me unloading the brush on my hand off camera, then soaking the wash up from the areas I want to remain lighter. The colour that we're adding to the armour here can be thought of as a combination of both environmental weathering and ambience, something that white is particularly prone to, as it's a colour that reflects all wavelengths of light. You could of course adjust the colours to match whatever setting you've chosen for your army. For a cooler tone, for example, you could substitute the brown for a hint of blue or purple perhaps, or you might add a touch of green for a forest setting. The general aim being of incorporating a hint of whatever tones you have in your basing in the armour. For the brightest areas, such as the top of the helmet and the shoulders, I want the wash to be as thin as possible to retain the strongest levels I can in the highlights. I'm now working around the rest of the figures in the same way. After coating the shields, I'm brushing them clean to leave just a gentle tint. Here you can see how much more natural the troopers look now that the armour matches the environment suggested by the basing. Along the way, I've chosen to paint this unit leader's pauldron using a mix of burnt orange and orange. And I've mixed a mid-grey tone for the rest. I'm also hitting this with the same wash that I used for the armour. And I'm now providing some highlights that lean more into the brighter orange tone. Some little stipples and scratches work fine here. And I'm now just painting the trim in black. For the marksman's pauldron in the Riot Control Squad, I chose to use a dark grayscale. I'm being pretty rough and sketchy here as I want quite a worn look, and I'll be adding some scratchy noise along the way. After applying a bit of texture, we can tone things down with some thinned black. I'm now using a dark grey to colour the upper section of the riot shields. I'll be returning to add some finishing touches here in a moment, but first I'm going to paint the KX series security droids. I'm first providing a base tone using Scalecolor's green-grey. This has a nice bluish black hue, and you could equally use black mixed with something like Prussian blue for a similar look. I'm applying a single layer of this to allow some of the underlying values to show through. And I'm using pure black for the blaster. You could actually leave the armour plating as it is if you like, as it already looks pretty much table ready. I've decided to indulge in some non-metallic metal style highlights however, and I'm simply adding white to the green-grey to build up the midtones and highlights. I'm being somewhat sketchy here, but you could be as neat or as free as you like. I'll sometimes jump to some fairly bright highlights even if it looks a little rough, then use some intermediate tones afterwards to smooth out the transitions. also adding a few scratches and touches of weathering along the way. We can use pure white to fill in the eyes. And I'm using Naples Yellow for the yellow detailing on the shoulder joints, mixed with a little white for the highlights. We can also add a few grey highlights to the blaster. And for one last optional touch, I chose to tint the undersides of the armour using burnt sienna. This is to create the impression of some environmental cast, and also simply to add some tonal interest and variation. I'm pretty much applying this like a heavy glaze into the shadows, playing with the intensity to my liking. I'm now adding a few final scratches and highlights. And I'm finishing the droids off by painting the two lights on the front, firstly in white, followed with some blue for the lower light. I'm using blue pigments by Hera models, but you could use any blue you like. Returning to the troopers, I'm now going to add some weathering. Here we can add various bits of environmental dirt, chips and scratches using whatever dark browns or greys you like. I like to use both the brush and sponge for applying effects like this. I'm also strengthening one or two panel lines which turned out a little light, although I find going too dark can look a little over-stylized. We can also add some fine scratches with a craft knife, provided you're careful. Along with the weathering, I'm also adding some specular highlights to the armour using white, which can initially be toned down with a little of the wash mix we produced earlier. And we can use pure white for the brightest glints. Notice I'm not working in layers here or doing any blending. I'm simply tapping the highlights on to provide a little extra contrast and sparkle. I might spend a little more time with the unit leader. Here, for example, I'm highlighting the black rim on the helmet with some grey. I'm also picking out some quick grayscale highlights for the various weapons and accessories, often using the side of the brush tip to more easily hit the edges. And here I'm providing some bright edge highlights to the shields along with plenty of weathering. I might even add a few spots of dark red. For the Riot Batons, I'm first ensuring we have a pure white undercoat. I'm then going to airbrush over some neon blue, using some masking tape to avoid hitting the trooper. Pretty much any mid to light blue tone would be fine, however. This could also be applied with the brush instead. We can then reapply a little thinned white into some of the recesses. There's also an orange power cable, and I'm returning to the orange mix we made earlier for the Pauldron. Finally, I'm returning to the bases, where I'm first adding some reddish weathering and a few sketchy highlights to the mechanical debris. I then chose to gently shade the ground, this time using a single drop each of the brown and black transparent paints, once again thinned with medium. And then following this with a light dry brush using golden brown and maybe a little khaki. Black is still my preferred colour for the rims of the bases, which I'll typically apply in a couple of layers. And to finish the figures off, I'm airbrushing on some ultra matte varnish for protection, although this can also be applied with the brush. These boys are now ready to join the battlefield. Thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode. As usual, you'll find a full product list in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online. My very special thanks go out to my amazing patrons for supporting this work. If you'd like to help me keep going, feel free to hit the Patreon link and pledge what you can. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Star Wars Legion. Happy painting!